Our next speaker is Dr. Fitzgerald. Dr. Fitzgerald's research has been characterized by an integrative approach to elucidating the mechanism of drug action, drawing on working cells, model organisms, and humans. His work contributed fundamentally to the development of low-dose aspirin for cardioprotection. Fitzgerald's group was the first to predict and then mechanistically explain the cardiovascular hazard from NSAIDs. He has also discovered many products of lipid peroxidation and established their utilities as indices of oxidant stress in vivo. His laboratory was the first to discover a molecular clock in the cardiovascular system and studied the importance of peripheral clocks in the regulation of cardiovascular and metabolic function. And based on his achievement, he has he received many awards. So today, Dr. Fitzgerald will present Translational Medicine, Pharmacology, and Drug Discovery. So Dr. Fitzgerald, please.
Thank you. So if I can have my first slide, please. Oh, here we are. Nope. So it's a great honor for me to be invited to speak at this opening symposium, and it's an enormous pleasure for me to return to this wonderful city. So, whoops, wish I hadn't done that. So these are exciting times. As we heard from Dr. Honjo, extraordinary hope in the field of cancer with the emergence of immunotherapeutics and particularly checkpoint blockade, but also other disruptive technologies, promising therapeutic advances in ways that we could only hope for even a decade ago, including gene editing, the resurgence of gene therapeutics, cellular therapeutics, small molecules, large molecules. But despite all this excitement, this remains a, despite all this excitement, this remains a tricky business. Although the number of new drugs approved by the FDA has picked up over the last few years, if one looks back to 1950 through to the present, the number of new drugs approved has remained relatively constant, while, as we know, the estimated cost of bringing a drug to market has ballooned substantially. So it remains a tricky business, an expensive business, and an increasingly difficult business to sustain with its current model and approach to drug development. So I'd like today briefly to talk to a few issues that represent the challenge that face us. First of all, I'd suggest that we have a deficit in human capital, in the skill sets necessary to translate findings from model systems into complex human biology. Secondly, I think there is a need to develop the infrastructure and program support in our academic institutions necessary to support this endeavor in the contemporary context. We need a more fluid interface between the public and private sectors, but if we are to achieve this, we need to take a more comprehensive approach to recognizing and managing conflict of interest. We have a serious societal challenge with respect to many of these new therapies in particular, but also older therapies around drug pricing. And at the same time, while addressing this challenge, we need to continue to foster innovation. And finally, I'd suggest that in this particular business, it's time to reconsider our assumptions around intellectual property. So I can touch on all of these things relatively briefly, but to begin with, human capital and infrastructure in academia. So if we look at the likelihood of a drug, once it has reached human experimentation, of it being approved, roughly from the period of phase 1 entry although it varies a little by field, it's somewhere between 10 and 15%. And what this slide illustrates is, as we move from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, most of the failures, once we reach human biology, occur in phase 2. Now, what phase 2 should be is the elucidation of the mechanism of drug action in humans. And most importantly, in this era of precision medicine, parsing the variability of drug response and understanding the factors that contribute to variability of drug response, as nicely highlighted by Dr. Honjo, even in the setting of the amazing breakthrough around checkpoint blockade. Unfortunately, what phase 2 has become is something after the completion of phase 1 that often involves an acceleration through pseudo underpowered efficacy studies, which lay the ground for as a prelude for miscalculations around the design of phase 3. And I would contend that this intersects with a lack of the relevant skill sets in the human capital involved in drug development that pertains to the original objective of phase 2. With that in mind, we, like many other academic institutions at the University of Pennsylvania, around 15 years ago, founded an Institute for Translational Medicine and Therapeutics, or ITMAT, and we focused on increasing the number of people who had the capacity to pursue their science at the interface between basic and early human clinical research. And the second objective of ITMAT was really to identify the challenges that confronted those individuals and to try to address them. Now, the reason we were keen to do that is we were conscious of a change in the pattern of drug discovery and drug development. Historically, large vertically integrated companies captured all of the elements of this highly complex and heterogeneous process, with academia playing a relatively minor role, but particularly around target identification and early proof of concept. But over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen the vertical disintegration of this programmatic approach to drug discovery and development, with, depending on the program, various sectors being drawn from pharma, from biotech, from academia. And along with this dispersal of modules across sectors, they are often dispersed geographically as well. So we were keen to try and equip our young investigators to be able to play in this multi-modular space. The institution's commitment to this type of translational science achieved architectural realization with the integration in the same structure of patient care, education, and translational science. Now, most importantly, this commitment was sustained over the last 15 years, and as well as surrogates of success, we've actually had some real outputs of this type of investment. And perhaps the most important of these are therapeutic breakthroughs, including the first 3 FDA-approved gene and cell therapeutic domains. So I'd like to consider a little the interface between academia and industry, which was actually crucial to the realization of success in those therapeutic programs that I alluded to. And what there is an increasing appreciation of in industry is the necessity to shift to what we are calling an understanding of human phenomic science, or deep phenotyping, even in relatively small numbers of people, to elucidate the mechanisms for inter-individual variability of drug response. So I think there can be several elements that we can foster over the next several years to really make this interface more fluid. The first of these is human capital. I believe that there's a real opportunity for training positions to be split between industry and academia. for faculty positions to be hybrid between the two sectors, and I think there can be a great encouragement of academics to do sabbaticals in the private sector. Indeed, presently I'm on sabbatical in a company in California. Along with this, though, we need to have a much more sophisticated appreciation of conflict of interest. I believe we can declare conflict of interest, and we need to do it in a much more comprehensive way than we do presently, where institutions report the fiscal remunerations from the private sector of their faculty. Besides fiscal conflicts, perhaps in academia we're even more susceptible to conflicts around fame and influence. And these conflicts may involve not just the investigator, but deans and indeed institutions. I think that sort of information needs to be put out into the public domain and let the relevant publics then decide how important this is. The present way that we present this information is really incomplete and potentially quite misleading. Whatever about the declaration of conflict of interest, I think it's a much bigger challenge to manage conflict of interest. In fact, I'm not even sure we can manage it. And therefore, I think the importance of declaring it is even emphasized. And I think we need to consider the broad types of fiscal remuneration and state them in an unapologetic way, as long as they can be justified by objective criteria. We're used to academics forming spin-out companies. We're used to them consulting. We're perhaps used to them sharing intellectual property as well. But it's a different issue when we move to these hybrid positions for trainees and for faculty as well. Now, drug pricing is a particular issue in the United States, but I don't think by any means is it confined to the United States, particularly with respect to these new breakthrough therapies. And we're reaching an unsustainable position, and we're reaching a position that presents a real societal challenge if we're to share equitably the benefits of breakthroughs in translational science. The poster child for the way the system is supposed to work is exemplified by the breakthroughs in hepatitis C, where administering a drug like this can get a very high cure rate with 12 weeks of administration. In fact, in this example, we have tiered pricing. We have high pricing in economies that nominally can bear it, and much more equitable pricing where the disease is prevalent, where the economic structure is weaker. And the National Academy of Science has estimated that if everybody in the United States with hepatitis C was treated with these drugs, the disease would be eliminated by 2030. However, there's a problem. First of all, the way the system is supposed to work, well, Gilead, who acquired rights for this first drug that was approved, spent $11 billion to acquire those rights. So they took a real chance. And you could say this is the way intellectual property is supposed to work. They took a chance and they should reap the reward. And indeed, prompted by that reward, Gilead recently spent a similar amount of money to acquire Kite Pharma, a CAR T-cell company. So this looks like a virtuous circle, at least in capitalist societies. However, if we go back to the cost of drug, at least the headline cost of drug in the United States, if everybody was treated that should be treated with hepatitis C, you would burst the entire drug budget for the country. Now, there are other examples of pricing which have caught the headlines. For example, the egregious elevation in price of Daraprim, a drug that's been around for a very long time and is important particularly to patients with AIDS. But if you look across the sector generally and look at the capacity of Medicare to bear the rise in prices, you can see that their drug budget has increased remarkably, even though the number of prescriptions has increased to a much smaller degree. And this hasn't happened by accident. For example, in 2017, there were almost 900 lobbyists deployed in Washington, D.C. With a fairly generous budget prompted to argue against the reduction of prescription drug prices. And other types of maneuvers, particularly in the US with direct-to-consumer advertising, have been used once a drug goes off patent and has generic competition to sustain the lifetime of the originally patented drug. So it's not surprising that these types of behaviors, both the legitimate ones and the less legitimate ones, are beginning to evoke a political reaction. For example, even in the last week, the New York Times urged consideration of an existing section in federal law that was deployed during the time of the anthrax scares to negotiate with Bayer for access to an antibiotic at a reasonable price. And deployment of this type of law, for example, could be used as a federal tool to drive negotiation around cost. So I don't know if these things will actually come to pass or not. It is on the political horizon. Even Mr. Trump has mentioned during his campaign that he would negotiate like crazy to reduce the price of prescription drugs. And needless to say, nothing has happened as far as that's concerned. But the point I'd make is that the pricing structure is unsustainable, and it is something that together we really have to address. So how do we foster innovation while containing costs and spreading benefit? Well, in the United States, the true cost to the patient is actually opaque. And really we need to have transparency in this discussion to be able to consider equitably what costing might be. There have been moves, particularly in Europe initially, now elsewhere, to configure reimbursement based on some estimate of results. The evaluations of what those results should also be transparent. And there can be regulatory initiatives to accelerate competition and to abolish strategies such as pay for delay. But I think this issue has become a really headline socio-political issue that we as pharmacologists have to help provide a solution to. So with that in mind, I'd just like to close by turning to some examples from the altruistic sector, suggesting that we might consider intellectual property reform. So there are examples in the altruistic sector of combination therapies, or indeed of novel drugs being brought to market for amounts of money that are considerably less than the estimated $3 to $4 billion that is a number that's often quoted, and builds in the cost of failure in what we all recognize is a remarkably inefficient process. So IP is very important in the innovative process. It's extremely important in biotech. Biotech companies use IP to raise money from various types of entities. And indeed, the system works extremely well. Most of this money is paid back after meeting the requirements. So this is a system that works well and that we disrupt with care if we do it at all. And yet we need to look to other sectors where different approaches to IP have been taken. For example, in the case of Tesla, IP for free. The more people that use this technology, the more electronic cars there will be on the road, the better for our market. So in drug development, IP is focused on the composition of matter. And the likelihood of that matter actually becoming an approved drug is extremely long. And as long as we had large vertically integrated companies doing virtually all the business, that really didn't matter so much because everybody who was involved would do well if the drug eventually became approved. But as we move to a more scattered, modular approach across sectors, across geographies, we have to think again about how we might approach this. Now, the World Cup is on at the moment. This guy's a little post-dated, but he illustrates a point, and that is that in drug discovery and development, we're well used to modeling. So we model drug targets, we model biological networks, we model PK/PD, we model market share, we model pricing. So maybe we could apply modeling to the process itself of drug discovery and development. Maybe we could, with a molecule in hand and an indication identified, anticipate where we'd see the greatest hurdles, engage the collaborators who would help us address those hurdles in a prospective agreement around reimbursement based on overcoming hurdles that we would anticipate to be the greatest. We would be wrong. So as we proceeded along the process, we could take the information that was accruing and revise the model in a Bayesian manner and adjust the rewards accordingly. And of course, even at the end, there would be discrepancies, and as we do now, we could use courts to resolve those discrepancies. But one big difference would be that some variation on this theme, and there could be many variants on revising IP, at least this postpones reward until value is actually realized in the shape of an approved drug. So I don't think this is necessarily a particularly radical or enlightened approach to the process, but I mention it only to prompt consideration of IP. Because, of course, we have other examples where there is IP around many components in the phones in your pocket, but the dominant IP is in the thing that actually works. So in conclusion, drug development is risky in development, but life-altering breakthroughs continue to be made. We should focus on development of human capital and create the infrastructure to let academia play in this modular space. And it's time to soften the barriers between academia and industry, but this requires a more comprehensive approach to declaring conflicts. Current pricing strategies are unsustainable and unfair, and it's time to question cost estimates of bringing a drug to market that are used to justify pricing. Thank you.
Thank you.